Hello, thank you very much for viewing this presentation on the relationships between external political efficacy and explanations for inequality, which is presented as part of the governance panel at the third annual UK Political Psychology Conference. My name is Joe Greenwood-Hau, and I'm a research fellow in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Strathclyde. The presentation takes a pretty standard approach, starting with the research questions. I'll then review the key literature on external political efficacy and system justification theory before outlining the hypotheses, data and measures, and then the details and results of the analysis and the conclusions. The research questions stem from a gap in the literature, which has observed that there are relationships between economic inequality itself and external political efficacy, as well as political trust, but has not observed as yet any relationships between explanations for inequality and external political efficacy. So the research questions, of course, attempt to address that gap, and they are focused on whether structural and individualized explanations for inequality in status relate to, most importantly, external political efficacy, then as a reference point, general social trust, and finally, the gap between those two. External political efficacy, of course, is the key dependent measure here, and it is the belief in the responsiveness of political institutions to citizens. It is distinct from internal political efficacy's concern with individual ability and from political trust concern with the public interest. And amongst other things, it is related to, or some might argue driven by, economic inequality, as noted on the previous slide, as well as re-engagement initiatives by the state and online engagement, both deliberative and otherwise. On the independent variable side, the presentation is informed by system justification theory, which posits a general tendency to defend, legitimize, and bolster the social and political systems on which people are psychologically dependent. Now, what this actually means in practice is that those who hold system justifying beliefs tend to think that social outcomes and statuses and positions are justifiable, they're okay, and they don't necessarily need to be critiqued. And such beliefs take the form of the Protestant work ethic, belief in status legitimacy, or belief in a just world. And what I'm particularly concerned here with is the difference between people who subscribe to structural explanations for status inequality in society and their own status, and those who subscribe to individualized explanations. And based on the system justification literature, my expectation is that structural explanations, which is to say non-system justifying beliefs for inequality, are negatively related to external political efficacy and positively related to general social trust. And as a corollary of this, I expect an interaction effect when we investigate the difference between explanations for one's own status and for status in society more generally, such that amongst those with structural explanations for status difference in society, structural explanations for their own status have a positive effect on the trust gap, and obviously the corollary of a negative effect of individualized explanations for their own status. The data used is from a two-wave survey that was fielded via YouGov to their online panel, from which 1,405 respondents were drawn, and that's almost 3/4 of the people who started the first wave. There are a lot of variables in the data set. The key variables for this presentation come from the second wave, and many of the control variables come from the first wave. And the first key variable, of course, is the dependent external political efficacy, which is a factor that was identified through confirmatory factor analysis based on these four measures, which are of appraisals of public influence at local and national level and of the responsiveness of councillors and MPs to complaints raised by individuals. And on the independent variable side, the key measures are again factors, again identified via confirmatory factor analysis. And the first of those factors on the top row relates to explanations for status inequality in society. The numbers on the x-axes represent rankings of these explanations. And the key explanations that load onto the factor are based on background, ambition, and hard work. And those are in opposition. So people who rank background highly as an explanation for status difference in society are more likely to rank ambition and hard work with lower value concomitantly. And then on the bottom row, we have the three measures that load onto the factor that represents external explanations for one's own status, and those measures are background, structural inequality, and inevitable differences. And these are not in opposition. So people who rank background highly as an explanation for their own status are also more likely to rank structural inequality and inevitability highly as explanations for their own status. These measures were included in OLS regressions with multiple imputation of missing values. That multiple imputation was used in the adjusted models with controls. The unadjusted models without controls required no multiple imputation because there is full coverage of the variables. The dependent variables are, as outlined, external political efficacy, for which I used the standardized factor score. Then general social trust is the standard 10-point scale, and the trust gap is that 10-point scale minus a adjusted version of the factor score. And the results are all presented on this slide, and they are, I hope, interesting. The left-hand column is coefficient plots, and each row represents one of the dependent variables. So the top row with panels A and B is for external political efficacy. The middle row with panels C and D is for general social trust, and the bottom row with panels E and F is for the trust gap between the first two measures. The right-hand column then shows margin plots with predicted values for the dependent variables and allows us to identify any interaction effects between explanations for status difference in society and explanations for own status. So, starting with the left-hand column, we can see that structural explanations for status difference in society are negatively related to external political efficacy and to general social trust, and that is to say that system justifying beliefs are, as anticipated, positively related to external political efficacy, but not as anticipated, also positively related to general social trust. There are, however, no significant relationships between any of the key variables and the trust gap, and indeed this means that there is no observable interaction effect between those variables, so that's counter to hypothesis 3. There is, however, an apparent but unanticipated interaction effect between individualized explanations, between explanations for status difference in society and explanations for own status in terms of their effect on external political efficacy, as we can see on panel B up here. And the effect of this is such that consistency of beliefs is clearly quite important. So those who are most trusting of the responsiveness of the political system have both individualized explanations for status difference in society and individualized explanations for their own status, whereas those who are the least trusting have structural explanations for status difference in society, but individualized explanations for their own status. And this is kind of one of the key, although unanticipated, findings of this presentation and this research, which is then reflected in the conclusions. So the first conclusion is that system justifying beliefs are, as anticipated by hypothesis 1, positively related to views of responsiveness of the political system. They are also positively related to views of general trustworthiness, which was not anticipated, is in fact counter to what was anticipated, and they are not related to the gap between those first two measures, which again was not anticipated. Further, not anticipated, consistency of beliefs about inequality is clearly important. So to put that as a concluding remark into simpler, more accessible language, it seems that seeing others, but not oneself, as the beneficiaries of privilege is linked to negative views of politics and trustworthiness of people more generally. Which potentially is quite a sobering finding, although there may well be a need for more research to see if this is applicable in other contexts and replicatable with other surveys. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. I look forward to talking to you about any points or questions you have relating to the presentation when the panel is run.